Hi, we're on a range, and today is part 2 in our series on accurate rifle shooting. Specifically today we're talking about shooting offhand, and there's 3 things I have to say to preface it. 1, shooting offhand does not mean being right-handed and shooting from your left side, or vice versa. Shooting offhand just means shooting from a standing, unsupported position. 2, nothing I say today should be inferred as any kind of tutorial. I am in no way trying to tell you what you should do. I'm only explaining and demonstrating the things I do and why. And 3, recently James Yeager said something about nose to the charging handle. Okay, when you're talking about the charging handle, you're really talking specifically about an AR platform. This is an AK platform, but I can still demonstrate it. And what he's talking about is getting your face right up here, not back here. And if there were a charging handle here, my nose would be against it. And he said, quote, "Nose to the charging handle is about shooting, not gunfighting," close quote. Okay, the debate over the validity of that statement is a topic for another time. But its relevance today is that the title of today's presentation is Accurate Rifle Shooting, offhand. We're talking about the techniques that I use to hit the target that I'm shooting at, whether it's a paper target or a deer or what have you. And speaking of paper targets, I have one set up at 50 yards. So as soon as I get my earplugs in, let's shoot it and see what kind of results I can get shooting offhand. Okay, let's go downrange and take a look at the target. Now, as we go downrange, let me take a moment and play tour guide. Off to my right, you'll see the pile of burned out garbage. And, wait for it, complete with beer cans on top of it. That kind of stuff is what gets places like this closed down. And when a place like this gets closed down, that guy is going to be the first to have a tantrum about those terrible anti-gunners that closed his range. And he won't be able to face his own culpability in that he's the reason it got closed down. Okay, here's our target. This one off here, and that's just me. The rest of them are all in the orange, and barely on some cases. But now, let me demonstrate some of the techniques I'm using when shooting targets like this. In talking about any shooting position, the main things are sight alignment, sight picture, trigger control, breath control, stance. In shooting offhand, trigger control becomes of paramount importance. But right now, let's talk about stance. If I'm going to engage a target, even if it's a deer, something that could move, even if it is moving, I'm not going to engage it like this. I'm just not going to do that. For demonstration purposes, so you can see it better, I'm going to aim this direction. I'm not going to be totally 90 degrees to the target, just a little bit off of 90 degrees. How much will depend on the rifle I'm using. And I'm going to put the rifle in my shoulder, and my support hand is going to be fairly far out there. How far will depend on the rifle I'm using. And then I'm going to pull back to create some isometric pressure. And I'll have my nose to the proverbial charging handle. There are variations on this that you'll see some people do. Some people will have an open hand and they'll want to lean back and have their arms supported against their body, then rest their magazine on their hand. Yes, I've seen people do this. And for some people that's stable, for me it's not. Also, I think it creates a shooting stance that is only applicable to paper targets on a static KD range, and you can't really adjust to any other kind of shooting from that. You'll also see people, instead of gripping the forestock, they'll put their hand flat. And again, that works for some people, not me. You'll also see that my hand is like this. Some people will want to turn that around. That might work for some people. For me, it feels like I'm moving at least one joint in a direction it's not supposed to go. Now, there are criticisms to this kind of offhand position. Many of them. But one is that you can't traverse from this position. If I were to be shooting at a deer and I were to not kill it with the first shot and it started running, that I wouldn't be able to traverse. Actually, from this position, I can traverse quite well. Some people will say that this position is very poor for traversing to my left. Let's see if I can do that. Looks okay to me. A variation on this technique is incorporating the sling. You have to make sure the sling is adjusted to the right length. Put your arm through, one wrap around, and then lock that into your shoulder. Some people think this makes offhand shooting a little more stable. Well, I have a target set up at 50 yards. Let's see how I do. This takes a little bit longer to get into that position than it does to just do this. But was it any more accurate? Let's go take a look at the target. Well, this group is certainly smaller than my last offhand group at 50 yards, but we also see a little bit of a shift in point of impact, and you have to be aware of that. That also brings me to the next topic of discussion. Now I have a new target set up, and I'm going to shoot this with my Wasser 1063 from a distance of 75 yards, but I'm going to shoot prone unsupported. There's a point to this, bear with me. Well, here's our group, and it's not a particularly stellar group. However, my aiming point was dead center, and the group is centered. But that's me shooting prone unsupported. Now I'll paste up these shot holes, go back 75 yards, do this drill again, but shooting offhand. We expect the group to be bigger, but let's see if that's the only difference we see. first group shooting from the prone was 6 shots. The second group shooting offhand was 8 shots. And no, I did not use the sling technique. Now you noticed that one of the shots in the second group knocked off one of the pasties, put it back on, moved it just enough to expose the newest bullet hole. So the 8 shots in our second group, in no particular order, are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This one that's way off, that's a flyer that really is just me. But what this target shows us is something very important. The prone group is centered. The offhand group is also centered. The 2 groups are in the same place. I have seen it occur that someone will zero their rifle, they'll sandbag it, they'll shoot from a prone supported or shoot from a bench or put the rifle in some kind of vise, and they'll get that thing zeroed. And then when they go to shoot offhand, they'll still have a good group, just in a totally different place. And there's a few reasons for that. One very common reason is sometimes it will change the way a person looks at the sights when they go from the bench to shooting offhand. Often optics will cure that problem. Another reason that can occur is problems with trigger control, which brings me to the next topic I want to discuss. Trigger control is a very important part of pistol or rifle shooting, but it becomes of paramount importance when you're shooting a rifle offhand. When you're zeroing and you've got the rifle locked in some kind of vise, if you yank the trigger, it might not move the rifle at all. And because in the vise you're not really concerned too much about recoil, you're probably not going to flinch too bad. When you're shooting from a bench and you've got the rifle all sandbagged, even if you do flinch a little bit, it's not going to tell on you nearly as much as it will if you're shooting offhand. Now, as you squeeze the trigger, it should be squeezing it, not yanking it. Even though we say pull the trigger, squeeze the trigger. You may have heard the acronym BRASS, B-R-A-S-S, breathe, relax, aim, stop, squeeze. Slow, steady squeeze. And it should surprise you when the rifle goes off. Even if you're having to shoot very fast at a running deer or whatever else might be running, it should still surprise you when it goes off. I have on many occasions seen someone come to the firing line and they'll get all situated and they'll start their squeeze and it'll go off and they'll say, "Wow, that surprised me when it went off." And that's the shot that hits the X-ring. Trigger control, again, is of paramount importance. This becomes even more difficult and more important when you're shooting a rifle that has a particularly poor trigger pull like this one. Let's take a close-up look. Now watch as I start my trigger pull. You see how much that trigger moves before it goes off? That is a lot of creep. Not only is there a lot of creep in this trigger, but something else that occurs, and I know it's not the rifle, it's just me, but as I pull it and it goes off, it doesn't seem like it's always going off in the same place, which can be good in the terms of it should surprise you when it goes off, but that much creep can allow you to move the rifle quite a ways off the target when you're flinching or jerking the trigger. So how do you correct that? The 2 main ways are, 1, lots of dry fire practice. Just dry fire practice. Now, some rifles should not be dry fired, so check your owner's manual or call the manufacturer. Most rifles are okay. Another thing you can do is dummy drills. Now, the way you do that is you take your magazine, get some dummy ammunition, and then have someone else load your magazine with a mixture of live rounds and a couple of dummies, or if there's no one else there, load your own magazine with your eyes closed, which is good practice anyway. And so you have some live rounds, but you've got a couple of dummies and you don't know where they are. And when you fired a live round or 2, and now you're going to fire again, but you don't know if this is a dummy or not, and as you pull the trigger, you see something like that really shows you what you're doing wrong and shows you your shortcomings in terms of trigger control. And there is no magic bullet to fix a problem like this. What it requires is lots of practice, lots of concentration on sight picture, and trigger control. Now, I could probably go on about offhand shooting all day, but that really hit the basics. Also, remember that nothing I say today should be inferred as any kind of tutorial or recommendation. These are just the techniques that I use. And thanks for watching the offhand rifle shooting video.